The race card is being used a lot right now in the media to divert from things that are really important. For example, Benghazi, the IRS, different things happening in Washington, D.C. But to clarify it a little bit, we have Larry Elder joining us tonight. Larry, what is your perspective on the Justice Department funding protest against George Zimmerman, even before he's been indicted?
Well, this apparently is some sort of program that was set up when they set up the Civil Rights Commission, and the idea is when there are areas that are so-called hotspots, they send people there. Another silly waste of time and waste of taxpayers' money. I'm not terribly offended by it. Not that much money was spent, but it is a program that's stupid and useless. We shouldn't have it.
You don't think it affected the trial at all?
I don't think so. You saw how the trial turned out. Even though Angela Corey brought these charges, never should have. In my opinion, I agree with Alan Dershowitz. She probably should be brought up on sanctions because apparently she hid the ball for the other side and didn't present documentary evidence and photo evidence till right before the trial. She's in trouble.
Well, that's true. And why was the mainstream media trying to make it all about race? What's your perspective on that?
Well, because that's the mainstream media's mantra. Racism remains a major problem in America, and frankly, not even racism, anti-black racism by white people. That's all they care about. If there's racism about Hispanics, because we have gang violence here in L.A. where Hispanic and black gangs are killing each other, that doesn't seem to bother anybody in terms of making national news. But if it's a white guy who does something against a black person, that becomes news. And then, the media loves to run with these stories. Racism, racism, racism. That's why Hollywood made this fraudulent movie called Hurricane about a guy who frankly murdered 3 people. That's why USA Today ran for all those days and weeks 2 years ago claiming that black churches were being burned. It turns out that USA Today red-faced, pardon the expression, had to apologize because black churches weren't being burned, but it was some fraudulent story which for reasons that escape me somehow became a national mantra. It's the same thing with Duke Lacrosse. That was a fraud. Jenna Six was a fraud, and this is a fraud.
Well, and it's really about, well, they're trying to make it about race, but the bottom line is they're not talking about all the things that are happening in Chicago. That's one thing.
Well, yeah, and there have been 480 people murdered since Trayvon Martin was killed in one city alone. 75%, by the way, of those homicides are uncleared, meaning they're unsolved. Where are the cameras? It seems to me that at least in the case of Trayvon Martin, the Martins know what happened to their son. In Chicago, 75% of these homicides are unsolved. How many crying mothers and fathers are there in Chicago? Nobody seems to give a damn about.
Last weekend alone, we had at least 6.
Yeah.
And we had, I think, 17 with injuries, but, they're just not going to talk about it. And why is it not, let's talk about black on black, or let's talk about Hispanic and black, or Asian?
It's easier to blame other people. If we were to talk about black on black crime, you have to get into the roots. And the roots is this social pathology, and the root of that is not having a dad in the house. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a book called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. He's a lefty. He's a Democrat. Later on became a Democrat from New York. And in that book at the time, he said 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. If we don't get a handle around this, this is going to be horrific for the black community and horrific for the country. Well, fast forward now, 75% of black kids are born outside of wedlock. 35% of white kids are. This is a neutron bomb dropped on the population, and we need to reverse that. And let me tell you something. The LA Times had a poll back in the mid-'80s, and poor people and non-poor people were asked the following question. Do you believe that young women get on welfare to have additional benefits? The majority of non-poor people said, oh, no, that's unfair. However, 64% of poor people said yes. We are incentivizing people into marrying the government. We're allowing men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility, and the left has done this. And instead of acknowledging it, they can't do that, so they talk about things like racism, sexism, and high-capacity magazines. Anything to divert your attention from the real problem, which is the meltdown of the family, which has been aided and exacerbated by the left.
And you touch a little bit about that in your book, Dear Father, Dear Son, correct?
I do. And the reason I wrote that book is because my dad and I had a rotten relationship. For 10 years, we didn't speak to each other, and it took me until I was 25 years old to appreciate the fact that he was in the house working very hard all those times. Okay, he was a little grumpy. He wasn't Ward Cleaver, but he was a good man.
But he was working real hard. I mean, wasn't he working 2 jobs?
He worked 2 full-time jobs as a janitor, cooked for a family on the weekend, and went to night school to get his degree, to get his high school degree because he dropped out of school when he was in the 8th grade. The point behind the book, though, is his father was abusive. My dad doesn't know who his biological father is. He was raised in a home where his mother had a series of abusive boyfriends, and still my dad did not rob and maim and steal. And I asked him why, and he said back in those days you didn't have a bunch of people like Al Sharpton telling you you were a victim, nor did you have welfare. You had to bust your butt and you had to make it. And my dad believes that welfare is one of the worst things that ever, quote, came down the pike, close quote. He used to always tell me that.
I believe that. And it's kind of a media avalanche, too. They seem to be pushing the big rock just making it go faster, too. It hasn't changed very much in probably the last 10 years. It's gotten worse, especially with social media.
Well, and the fact is that a story that's a fraudulent story can, as you know, go around the world real quickly. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of evidence never came out. For example, did you know that his prom date was black? Most people don't know that. He had a black business partner. Most people don't know that. And he went to bat for a black homeless guy who was apparently beaten by the son of a police lieutenant. Nothing was done until Zimmerman and others began to agitate, and they got the lieutenant fired, and ultimately the police chief was fired for not doing enough. The police chief would never have been fired for dragging his feet on the investigation of the black homeless man who was beaten up by the son of a police lieutenant. It was all inside baseball, and Zimmerman yelled and screamed and got something done. Yet he's this racist.
Well, that's the thing, and this is pretty recent. This isn't something that they buried 5 years ago.
That's right, and you know, there was a murder, a gruesome murder, series of murders in the 2000s in Knoxville, Tennessee. Two white students were brutally beaten, raped, tortured, and killed by 4 black men. And they didn't file hate crime charges. And the reason the authorities said is that there was no evidence that, however horrific this was, there was no evidence that they were motivated by race. Indeed, the black men had white friends. Indeed, they dated white women. Well, if that's the definition of a non-hater, then George Zimmerman certainly is a non-hater, considering he went to a prom with a black woman and had a black business partner and so forth.
Well, what about his mother?
His mother was Peruvian, and it turns out his great-great-grandfather was black. And that's why the media at first called him white, then called him Jewish, and then they didn't know what to call him because they couldn't figure out what box to put him in.
Exactly, and that's the problem, is the box.
It's the box.
And why is it that Obama can call himself African-American, but Zimmerman can't call himself Latino? I'm curious if you have an answer to that one.
No, I sure don't. I remember somebody called up once and said, well, what about Zimmerman's father? He was white. I said, okay, what about Obama's mom?
Well, I guess it must be, maybe it's a mother-father thing.
Well, I'm not sure about that. In the Jewish tradition, it's the mother that determines your ethnicity.
Well, that's
and
true.
George Zimmerman's mother is Peruvian. So therefore, if we're using the Jewish tradition, then he is a Latino.
Wow. That makes it more complicated.
It is complicated.
Now,
and notice the jury and the black alternate all said that race had nothing to do with it from what they can tell. These are 6 people who were not influenced by the media. They weren't listening to MSNBC. They were sequestered. And they were all apparently surprised when they found out so many people in the media thought this case was about race. They didn't. And the black juror, who's the alternate, apparently I heard he was black, also agreed with the verdict and didn't feel that it had anything to do with race at all.
well, it's interesting, too, because these people were not affected by the media, yet they really hung Zimmerman last year. He didn't really have a chance before the trial, if you look at it that way.
Well, and that's exactly right. The media had crucified him. And I thought when I first heard this story, I bet you did too, that the police, the night in question, just said, hey, George, what's up? And he goes, hey, what's going on? I'll see you at home. They took him to the station. They handcuffed him. They took him out to the scene the next day. It wasn't like they did a half-blank examination. It was pretty thorough. And it vindicates the police chief who was fired for not pressing charges against Zimmerman. He felt that there wasn't sufficient ground and that if they had done so, they were not going to prevail in court. He was right.
And considering the case with the homeless black man from the year before, the cop they were going after was actually one of the officer's sons. So
right.
it could have gone completely the other way.
It could have, yeah. It was the son of a police lieutenant who beat up a black homeless guy. Nothing was done, and George Zimmerman agitated. The other thing, too, about this thing is stand your ground was not used in this trial at all, but people still are upset with the stand your ground law. Obama, as you know, made a reference to it. We have a couple of resolutions out here by politicians in California refusing to do any business in a state that has a stand your ground law. Well, it turns out when Obama was a state lawmaker in Illinois, he co-sponsored a bill to strengthen the already existing stand your ground law in Illinois. Is this thing on? That was about 9 years ago.
And now you say that's evolving.
Well, he's evolved. You don't say politicians lie anymore. You just say they evolved.
I think that's Obama's favorite word. All right. Well, Larry, thank you so much for being here with me today. And tell us a little bit more about your book before we go.
Well, I wrote the book because I want people who don't have good relationships with their fathers and people who are fathers who have bad relationships with their children or non-existent ones to realize the importance of this. As well-adjusted as I think I am, I'll pause while you laugh, after my dad and I reconciled, I just felt better. I felt happier. I felt more confident. I felt more loved. There is an itch when your father is not around. Tupac Shakur, that well-known neocon, said, I know for a fact if I had a father in my life, I would have had some discipline and I would have been more confident. confident. He also talked about why he started running around with gangs. He wanted structure. He wanted protection. That's the other thing. When your father is not there and you're living in the inner city, who's going to protect you? Who's going to protect you against other people? And that's why a lot of people join gangs if for no other reason than security. We've got to do something about these large number of households who were raised without dads. We have to change the law so that we no longer have these incentives, and we have to do what George Herbert Walker Bush said, which is 1,000 points of light, and make sure that we volunteer and give money to organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters, 100 Black Men, the National Fatherhood Initiative, which is an organization that I support. There are lots of self-help groups around the country. We need to empower them and get them in the community to get hands-on assistance.
I think empowerment is absolutely key, and we have to do that. We can start doing that in the media too, by instead of dividing, maybe pulling people together.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Let's do this again.
My pleasure.
Let's not let the mainstream media distract us from what's really important. Let's focus on the truth. Getting the answers. Do your homework. Remember, it's a war on for your mind.
And finally tonight, in response to Obama's war on whistleblowers, the Oath Keepers are putting up pro-Snowden signs all over the D.C. area, calling on even more whistleblowers to come forward. The first sign at the Pentagon station is done in the style of the theater scene from George Orwell's 1984 and features Director of National Intelligence James Clapper as Big Brother. The sign makes it clear that by exposing the NSA spying on Americans, Snowden honored his oath. The second sign, now in place at Pentagon Station, is aimed directly at CIA employees, reminding them that their oath is not to a corporate culture of secrecy. And the third sign is intended to reach military personnel within the Pentagon and any other government employees who have ever served in the military, using the Iwo Jima flag raising as a backdrop to the message. Now, you can read more about our top stories by going to INFOWARS.com. But if you want to learn more about how the mainstream media is deliberately trying to tyrannize our minds, pick up a copy of State of Mind. It is being sold exclusively at the INFOWARS store. It is being sold exclusively at the INFOWARS store. Now, you can also watch State of Mind if you are a member of Prison Planet TV. And we just want to say thank you so much to all of our subscribers at Prison Planet TV, because you allow us to continue telling this truthful news. You can share your username and password with up to 10 other people, so spread the truth. Thank you guys so much for watching the InfoWars Nightly News. I'm Leanne McAdoo. Now you can watch The Alex Jones Show live as it happens at Infowars.com/show.
You'll find links to all of our content there and a free 15-day trial for Prison Planet TV.
More than 60 movies and documentaries all in one place at Infowars.com/show.